March 20th, 2026, 11:47 p.m. local time. The sirens that Tel Aviv residents have learned to live with began wailing across central Israel. But this time, something was different. Within minutes, the night sky over Rehovot erupted into dozens of bright streaks. Not the clean interception flashes Israeli citizens had seen for weeks, but something else entirely. Small glowing objects descending in a deadly swarm pattern. Residents filming from their balconies captured the moment when Israel's most protected interior cities came under the first confirmed cluster munition bombardment of this war. At least 17 people were rushed to hospitals. Fires broke out simultaneously across 5 separate neighborhoods. And for the first time since this conflict began, Iranian missiles carrying submunitions penetrated deep into Israeli territory that was supposed to be untouchable. Over the next 12 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what Iran just fired at Israel's heartland, why cluster bombs change everything about this war, and the one number that proves Israel's defense architecture is collapsing faster than anyone predicted. Before we continue, your support is what makes this channel possible. If you want unfiltered analysis that mainstream media won't show you, make sure you're subscribed. Now let's get into what really happened last night, because the official statements from both governments are hiding the most critical detail. The attack began at 11:47 p.m. when Iranian ballistic missiles launched from positions inside western Iran. The Israeli Defense Forces confirmed detecting multiple inbound threats. Arrow and David Sling systems engaged immediately. Interception rates, which the IDF had claimed were holding steady at 85 to 90% throughout this conflict, suddenly meant nothing because the missiles that reached Israeli airspace weren't carrying conventional warheads anymore. They were carrying cluster munitions. And cluster munitions don't need to survive interception to cause devastation. They just need to get close enough to open. Here's what witnesses in Rehovot reported. The initial interception attempt succeeded. Israeli interceptors destroyed at least 3 incoming missiles at high altitude. But seconds after those interceptions, the sky filled with secondary objects, small bright fragments descending in a wide dispersal pattern. Each one was a submunition, a self-contained explosive charge weighing approximately 2.5 kilos, falling at terminal velocity with no guidance system, no propulsion, just gravity and high explosive filling. The first impact struck residential neighborhoods in Rioi's eastern district. Eyewitnesses described a sound like firecrackers, dozens of small detonations instead of one large blast. Within 90 seconds, emergency services received reports from 7 different locations simultaneously. Shattered windows, vehicle fires, structural damage to apartment buildings, and casualties scattered across an area roughly 800 meters wide. Petah Tikva, 15 kilometers to the north, reported a similar pattern 14 minutes later. Missile fragments verified by IDF bomb disposal teams as cluster submunitions landed in 3 separate residential zones. At least 2 fires were started by incendiary effects. One submunition penetrated the roof of a residential building and detonated inside, injuring 4 people. The dispersal radius in Petah Tikva was estimated at over 600 meters from a single missile release point. This is not a precision weapon. This is an area saturation weapon, and it just proved it works against one of the most defended airspaces on Earth. Now let me explain why this attack represents a strategic inflection point that most analysts are missing. Cluster munitions have been used in this conflict before. Iranian forces deployed them during the June 2025 war. But those strikes targeted military installations and open areas near the Lebanese border. What happened on March 20th is different. Iran just demonstrated the capability to deliver cluster warheads into Israel's interior population centers, cities that house millions of civilians, cities that are supposed to be protected by $10 billion worth of layered air defense systems. Rehovot sits 20 kilometers south of Tel Aviv. Petah Tikva is 10 kilometers east. These are not border towns. These are core metropolitan areas. The weapon system used in this attack is almost certainly the Kabar Shechan medium-range ballistic missile, the same platform Iran has been deploying throughout this conflict. But the warhead configuration is what matters. Standard KBR shotgun carries a 550 kilo unitary warhead designed for precision strikes against hardened targets. The cluster variant sacrifices that precision for area coverage. Iranian military sources have stated that their cluster warheads carry between 18 and 24 submunitions, depending on the configuration. Each submunition is designed to detonate on impact or shortly after, maximizing fragmentation effects against personnel and soft targets. The warhead opens at approximately 1,500 to 2,000 meters altitude. At that height, the submunitions scatter across a cone-shaped dispersal zone. The exact radius depends on release altitude and missile trajectory, but verified footage from last night suggests a pattern consistent with 500 to 800 meter coverage areas. Here is the engineering reality that makes cluster munitions so devastating against missile defense systems. Traditional air defense is designed to intercept and destroy a single object, the missile itself. If the intercept succeeds before warhead separation, the threat is neutralized. But if the intercept happens after the cluster shell has opened, you're no longer defending against one target. You're defending against 20 targets simultaneously, and none of them have the radar cross-section speed or flight profile that your interceptors are designed to engage. Iron Dome cannot intercept a falling submunition. It's too small, too slow, and too close to the ground by the time the system could calculate a firing solution. Arrow interceptors cost $3 million each and are designed to hit ballistic missiles in the upper atmosphere. They are useless against bomblets that separate at 2,000 meters. David's Sling occupies the middle ground, but it faces the same problem. By the time the cluster shell opens, the individual submunitions are already on ballistic descent trajectories that no existing Israeli system can engage effectively. The cost arithmetic is what should terrify Israeli defense planners. A K-Bar Shakan missile costs Iran approximately $400,000 to $600,000 to manufacture, depending on which intelligence estimate you believe. Loading it with a cluster warhead doesn't significantly increase that cost. Submunitions are simple devices, steel casings filled with explosive and fragmentation material, no guidance systems, no propulsion, no sophisticated electronics, just explosive physics. To defend against that $500,000 missile, Israel fires interceptors worth $3 to $5 million combined. And even if the interception succeeds at destroying the missile body, the submunitions that scattered before impact still reach the ground. Israel is spending 10 times more per engagement than Iran. And the engagements are not preventing damage. They are just reducing it. That is not a sustainable defense posture. That is a slow bleed. Now, here's the detail that proves Israel's defense capabilities are degrading faster than official statements admit. According to IDF data released earlier this week, interception rates against Iranian ballistic missiles have held steady between 85 and 90% since the conflict began on February 28th. But that statistic measures successful destruction of the missile body. It does not measure whether the warhead was neutralized before it could deploy its payload. Last night's attack in Rehovot and Petah Tikva proves the distinction matters. Israeli interceptors destroyed the missiles. The IDF will count those as successful intercepts, but the submunitions still landed, people were still injured, fires still broke out, and neighborhoods are still contaminated with unexploded ordnance. A 90% interception rate is meaningless if 100% of the attacks still cause casualties. The broader pattern emerging from this conflict shows that Iran is adapting faster than Israel can respond. In the first week of Operation True Promise 4, Iranian missile strikes focused on military targets, air bases, radar installations, command centers. Interception rates were high because Israeli defenses are optimized for exactly that threat profile. By the second week, Iran began targeting dual-use infrastructure, power stations, communication hubs, transportation nodes. Interception rates remained high, but economic damage started accumulating. Now in the third week, Iran is targeting population centers with area effect weapons specifically designed to overwhelm point defense systems, and the casualty figures are rising. Israeli hospitals reported treating 17 people from last night's attacks. 5 are in serious condition with shrapnel wounds. The rest suffered injuries from flying glass, structural collapse, and burns from secondary fires. That number might sound small compared to the scale of bombardment this region has endured, but it represents a trend line that Israeli officials cannot ignore. Casualties from Iranian missile strikes are increasing week over week, not because Iranian missiles are getting more accurate, but because Iranian tactics are getting smarter. Cluster munitions don't need accuracy, they need altitude and release timing. And Iran has clearly mastered both. The economic implications extend far beyond immediate reconstruction costs. Rehovot and Petah Tikva are not isolated towns. They are integrated suburbs of the greater Tel Aviv metropolitan area, home to over 400,000 people combined. The insurance industry is already reeling from damage claims filed across Israel since this war began. Standard property insurance policies in Israel exclude war damage. The government created a special compensation fund in early March. But that fund was designed to cover isolated strikes on military-adjacent areas, not sustained bombardment of civilian neighborhoods with submunitions. The cost per incident just multiplied. Instead of one impact crater requiring one cleanup team, each cluster strike creates dozens of impact sites spread across hundreds of meters. Each site requires bomb disposal teams to sweep for unexploded submunitions before civilian access can be restored. That process takes days, sometimes weeks. Unexploded cluster submunitions are a long-term hazard that persists far beyond the immediate conflict. International humanitarian organizations have documented cluster munition contamination in conflict zones that remains lethal for decades. Lebanon still has unexploded submunitions from the 2006 war. Laos still has unexploded ordnance from the 1970s. These weapons do not come with expiration dates. They sit in gardens, under debris, in fields, waiting for disturbance. Children are particularly vulnerable because the submunitions are small, sometimes brightly colored, and can be mistaken for toys. Israel now faces the prospect of long-term civilian areas contaminated with explosive hazards that will require systematic clearance operations lasting years. The political ramifications are equally severe. Cluster munitions are banned under the Convention on Cluster Munitions, an international treaty signed by 112 countries. Iran has not signed, neither has Israel, neither has the United States, but the use of these weapons against civilian population centers is widely condemned by international humanitarian law, regardless of treaty status. Amnesty International released a statement within hours of last night's attack, calling Iran's use of cluster bombs against Israeli cities a potential war crime. Human Rights Watch issued a similar condemnation. The International Committee of the Red Cross stated that cluster munitions are inherently indiscriminate and their use in populated areas violates the principles of distinction and proportionality under international humanitarian law. Iran's response to these condemnations has been predictable. Iranian officials point out that Israel has used cluster munitions in previous conflicts, including during operations in Lebanon. They argue that the prohibition on cluster munitions is selectively enforced by Western powers, and that Iran is simply responding to aggression with equivalent force. The moral high ground in this conflict is contested territory, and both sides have committed acts that international law considers violations. But the escalation to cluster munitions in civilian areas represents a threshold crossing that changes the nature of what comes next. Here is what terrifies me about the trajectory we are on. Cluster munitions are not the top of Iran's escalation ladder. They are somewhere in the middle. Iran has chemical weapons capabilities that it has never publicly acknowledged. It has biological research programs. It has missiles with longer ranges, larger warheads, and more destructive payloads than anything deployed so far. Every time Israel conducts strikes inside Iran, Iran responds with a weapon system one tier higher on the escalation spectrum. The pattern is clear. Iran started with conventional ballistic missiles, then maneuverable warheads, then saturation tactics, now cluster munitions. What comes next? And more importantly, where does this stop? The United States has stated publicly that it expects this conflict to last 4 to 6 weeks before achieving its military objectives. We are now in week 3. Iranian missile stockpiles have not been exhausted. Iranian launch platforms have not been destroyed in sufficient numbers to halt operations. Iranian command and control remains intact despite targeted strikes on IRGC facilities. The supreme leader was assassinated on day 1, and Iran installed his son as a replacement within 8 days. The government did not collapse. The military did not fracture, and the missile launches never stopped. The pre-war assessment from the U.S. National Intelligence Council concluded that a large-scale assault on Iran was unlikely to topple the regime. That assessment has been proven correct, but the military operations continued anyway, and now we are in a war with no defined exit strategy and an adversary that is escalating faster than anyone planned for. Share this video to every person you know who still believes this conflict is under control. March 20th, 2026, cluster munitions falling on Rahovat and Petah Tikva. 17 people hospitalized, fires across 5 neighborhoods, unexploded submunitions scattered through residential areas. Defense systems that cost $10 billion collectively unable to prevent bombardment of Israel's interior cities. Iran demonstrated last night that it can reach any target in Israel with weapons specifically designed to defeat interception. And the casualty rate is climbing. This is not the trajectory of a war that is being won. This is the trajectory of a war that is consuming everything in its path. and neither side has defined what victory looks like, let alone how to achieve it. The missiles keep falling. The fires keep burning. And the question no one in Tel Aviv, Tehran, or Washington wants to answer is simple. What happens when the escalation ladder runs out of rungs? Thanks for watching.